Great. All right, then. Well, I'll get started. Um, Good morning to you all. It's an honor and privilege to be here as the opening act for this great conference. I'm joining the conference from a small village in Scotland called Fruchi, and I'm in my living room, and it's sort of my living room office. And I'm framed by a bookshelf and a plant named Harry, and a heron painting by my friend and co-author of Web Style Guide, Pat Lynch. And I'm a white woman with short gray hair, which turns out to be a really good pandemic hairstyle, as long as you have clippers. I look forward to learning from you and with you over the next few days. And speaking of learning, I actually have a new job. I'm no longer with TPGI, but I'm working on a research project at the University of Southampton. It's called Teaching Accessibility in the Digital Skill Set. And I'm on a team with Sarah Luthwaite and Andy Coverdale, and it's this amazing opportunity, and I'm so fortunate to have it. So what we're trying to do is understand how accessibility teaching and learning differs from other topic areas and disciplines. And we are going to develop a framework for teaching accessibility, which I think is really cool. And so over the past months, I've been interviewing interview recordings and transcripts from expert teachers around the globe. And one of my key takeaways so far is that in teaching accessibility, learners engage best when they're invested in some way in the topic, when it's real rather than abstract, when the learning is active, authentic, and relevant. And with that in mind, my talk today is a little different, a little experimental. And thanks for bearing with me as we try some things out together. It might get a little bit messy, but I hope and think it will be worth it. Take, for example, homework. You don't normally get homework for conferences, but some of you responded to my pre-session survey, and I'll be sharing insights from that survey throughout my session. But if you haven't filled it out, there's an opportunity to do that now. It just takes a couple of minutes, and I think the link is probably in the chat, but it's also, I'll read it out as surveymonkey.co/r/7G7LPNV. And if you can take a minute, go ahead and do it, and or do it during a break or later today. And I'm going to be sending a summary email out to all of you later in the week with the data from the survey. So A Web for Everyone is the title of a book that I co-authored with Whitney Quisenberry. And the topic for today is your role in making a web for everyone. And sometimes I like to break things down into equations. So if we think about that as an equation, it looks something like you plus your role plus accessibility equals a web for everyone, or something like that. I'm actually not very good at math. So I'm better with concepts, and what we're going to explore today are two pretty big themes: doing accessibility and being accessibility, which are really big. So I've broken them down into two sections. And the first section is defining accessibility roles. And in that section, we'll talk about position descriptions and how they help us define our roles and responsibilities and be intentional about doing them. And the second section is a walkthrough of a few accessibility roles. And we'll look at a couple of roles and the duties and responsibilities associated with those roles. And throughout throughout this session, I'll be focusing on tools and resources like standards, processes, and procedures, teaching and learning that can support us in making a web for everyone. You can ask questions in the Q&A. You can also use the chat. I'll pause at various points during the session to answer questions. And there will be a follow-up email later in the week with the survey results and also some resources for you to take forward, and my contact details in case you have questions. We're covering a lot today and over the weekend. We want to make sure you get what you need to move forward. When I started working on this talk, I decided to use a resource called the Accessibility Skills Hiring Toolkit from Teach Access. Now, Teach Access is a collaboration between education advocacy and industry, and it's aimed at bringing and embedding accessibility into the higher education curriculum. And one of the aspects of that project is increasing the demand and the visibility for accessibility knowledge and skills in the workforce, making that demand visible to motivate attention to the supply. And one of the ways that we're doing that is through the Accessibility Skills Hiring Toolkit. And I decided on this approach for a few different reasons. One is that I'm part of the team that created the toolkit, and I'm really proud of the work that we did. But also it's really good. It's a good way to look at accessibility responsibilities and qualifications and the kind of interview questions you might encounter to give you a sense of what you might see in your current position or in your future positions. And it might be useful to you when you're hiring or to share with your HR team to help with hiring in there. But the more I worked on the talk, the more I came to realize that job descriptions are more than busy work or, paper pushing. They're a declaration of our intent. It's kind of a contract with our employer, certainly, but with ourselves. And it's how we say in writing, this is where I'm going to focus my energy. This is what I'm going to do. And to some extent, this is who I am and who I strive to be. And all too often we stumble into our roles, or sometimes we're pushed into different roles. And maybe that's how we ended up here today and looking at accessibility and learning about accessibility. Accessibility might not be a primary focus of your job or a formal part of your role. And so, for example, one of the questions on the survey is accessibility the primary focus of your current job? And of those who responded, 16 responded yes, and 27 responded no to that. So taking time now to explore and define our roles and responsibilities is an opportunity to choose accessibility. Now, I also know that some of you don't have position descriptions for your current job, never mind one that includes accessibility. 6 of you said you don't have a position description and 6 of you are not sure, but don't let that stop you as we move forward with this topic. There's no reason not to define your own role, even if it only goes no further than your notepad. So let's take a minute to review the roles that you responded to on the survey. The large majority of you are content focused, looking at the content editor role, authoring content. 13 of you are accessibility specialists. Another role is multimedia producer. 8 of you are in that role. 7 are quality assurance testers. 6 are front-end developers and instructional designers, social media editors. Those are all 6 of you. Project manager is another role. There are 5 of you in that role. UX, visual designer, there are 4. Product support, there are 4. Product owner manager, 3. Program owner manager, 2. UX researcher, 2. Information architect, 2. UX interaction designer, 1. Sourcing procurement officer, 1. And there are no legal counsels among us. And there are 12 other roles. So my takeaway from the response so far to the survey is that many of you are focused on creating content and publishing content and sharing content. And some of you are involved in, responsible for programs and products. And some are responsible for developing products. So for this next section, as we explore accessibility roles, I invite you to start work on describing your accessibility responsibilities and duties, the ones that you have currently and the ones you aspire to have. And you can use the roles from the toolkit or just start from scratch. So let me show you the toolkit. This is the URL for the Teach Access website. So it's teachaccess.org. And I'm going to go there. And hopefully you are now seeing the Teach Access website. I'm looking to my trusty assistant and got the thumbs up. This is the Teach Access website, and you're welcome to go have a look now if you're able to do that. If you go to the resources link and go to the accessibility skills hiring toolkit, that's where these position descriptions and qualifications and interview questions are all provided, and they're provided for different roles. And if there's a role here that maps to a role that you're in or that you aspire to be in, you might go ahead and download the file for that now, and we can use that as we move forward. So I will pause for a moment right now before we continue on to just give you a moment if you are downloading a document and to answer any questions you might have at this stage. Are there any questions so far?
No questions yet, Sarah.
Great. It's perfectly clear so far. That's great. All right. Well, we'll pause at various points. So please do ask questions if you have them. So at this point, we're going to start an accessibility roles walkthrough. Now, many of us have multiple roles and wear multiple hats. And certainly as in my role, I am a procurement officer, I am a designer, a developer, program manager, content author, the list goes on. It just depends on what it is that I'm engaged in doing. And if that sounds like you, which it is likely to do, then your accessibility responsibilities should really focus on all those roles. Now, many of you do have accessibility in your position descriptions, and there are 17 who responded who said that they do have accessibility, 14 responded that they do not, and 5 said they were not sure. In this section, as we move forward, we might find language that is relevant to you in your role. So let's start with the product owner manager role. The Teach Access hiring toolkit describes that role as someone who defines and manages digital products. And now, for the sake of our conversation, we can really think about that in a broader way, to think about anyone who is responsible for digital products and programs. And when I say programs in this case, I mean any kind of program that takes place in the digital context. Another way that let me continue on, anyone who is accountable for the success of those programs and products. So let's look at what that might look like if you did have that in your position description. Teach Access talks about 4 responsibilities. apply user-centered design and inclusive design practices, prioritize accessibility when designing, developing, and managing digital products, manage accessibility as a compliance level concern, and require support for accessibility in development and program resources. Now let's have a look at just one of those responsibilities, manage accessibility as a compliance level concern. And when we think about other attributes of our digital world, like security and privacy, those are commonly managed as compliance level concerns. And if we add accessibility to that list, what does that look like? The good news is that we have standards, and you may not love standards, and you may even subscribe to the idea that accessibility is about much more than standards. And both of these perspectives are valid, but I've really come around to appreciating standards. I recently did the ADA coordinator training program and really saw firsthand how much standards have informed accessibility work in other contexts. So when we think about the physical environment, we have these standards to measure against, and we can measure attributes. Like if we're designing a door or presenting a facility with the entryway, we don't need to figure out how to design that door. We have standards that we can use to measure the width and the different attributes of it. And we can identify where it doesn't meet those standards. We can create a transition plan to bring that facility into compliance. And with the support of standards, we can really manage compliance and access as that level of concern. And if we think about the digital equivalent of a door, which might be, let's say, like a login screen or an account sign up, we can look to standards to help us define the attributes of that digital entryway and measure conformance, identify areas of non-conformance, and make a plan for addressing those issues. So as we think about that aspect of this role of managing accessibility as a compliance level concern, if we are building digital products and programs, we want to include accessibility as one of our compliance level concerns. We want to evaluate and audit, let's say, any major product release if we're developing a product. We want to document conformance with standards in our products and identify areas of non-conformance. And we want to have a roadmap to address those areas. If we're not building, but we're using digital products maybe to provide our programs, as so many of us are doing these days, we want to include accessibility compliance as a requirement when we're evaluating products. And we want to require vendors to provide documentation of conformance with standards and ask vendors how they plan to address any areas of non-conformance. But as with most things, accessibility is really a shared responsibility, and there are so many interdependencies. And so while we're currently thinking about the role that owns and manages a program or a product, we really need to think about all the others who play a part in managing whether that can be managed as a compliance level concern. And so any role that is involved in creating digital products and resources, the content editors, the content publishers, the media producers, the instructional designers, you are all the digital makers. You're the architects, you're the builders, you're the writers. And just as an architect, you wouldn't design the library, for example, without attention to things like strength and stability and safety. And as a builder, you wouldn't sort of compromise structural integrity by using flimsy materials and not using screws and fasteners. And as a writer, you wouldn't write a book without paying attention to grammar, structure, and clarity. With technology, accessibility is as fundamental as those quality attributes that we consider to be basic professional requirements. And so in this case, while the product or program manager might be accountable ultimately for managing compliance, they can't be successful without the writers, designers, engineers who take accessibility as a professional responsibility and follow accessibility standards. So if you have a hand in designing or building content, your responsibility is really to follow accessibility standards. It's pretty simple. And if you don't do that, then accessibility really cannot be managed as a compliance level concern by you, by your manager, or by your organization. And standards can be a pretty daunting task, learning standards. They're complicated and there are a lot of facets to them. The good news is there are also excellent places to learn. And I wanted to recommend starting with the Web Accessibility Initiative resources for your role. And I'm just going to show you that quickly so you can see that the URL for that is w3.org/WAI/roles. I'm sharing the roles resource because the resource has been segmented into different roles, which is perfect for our conversation. We're talking about content writers and designers, and the resources are grouped together. So we have a lot of content people in the group here today. So go look at the resources for content writers and see what you can learn about following standards. So I think I'll pause for a moment now as well to see if there are any questions so far.
No questions yet, Sarah.
All right, great. So let's talk briefly about the role of instructional designer. That's another role that Teach Access has a toolkit for. And it's described as an instructional designer creates, produces, and publishes digital instructional resources. And again, for the sake of our discussion today, we can broaden that to really think about anyone who is responsible for creating, producing, and publishing content. And so similar roles might be content author, content editor, social media editor. So if we think about what that role looks like and accessibility responsibilities in a position description for that role, Teach Access lists the following responsibilities: create content with accessibility in mind, create alternatives for multimedia content such as captions and audio descriptions, use platforms and tools that support accessibility, and partner with colleagues and team members to prioritize accessibility in content production. So one aspect of the hiring toolkit is interview questions, and that is another source of insight into what it looks like to have an accessibility role. And so for this segment, we'll talk through one of the interview questions. These are intended to help people who are screening and interviewing applicants. And one of the instructional designer interview questions is, when giving a presentation, what are key considerations you make to ensure you are presenting content in an accessible manner? And this seemed like a pretty good question given the context. So I thought about, okay, well, how would I answer that? And one key aspect of that is thinking about the platforms that we use. And so as with a physical venue for a program, we need to understand the limitations of our digital venue and make a plan for working around those issues. And so for this conference, we're using Zoom. And as a presenter, I need to think about, okay, what features of the platform have accessibility issues? Are those features essential for my use? And if they are, how can I use them effectively and not cause unnecessary barriers? Now, one place to look for this type of information is on the product website. And with Zoom, we can look at the accessibility conformance report. So I'm on the Zoom accessibility page, and it has a good deal of detail about their platform. But the specific thing that I want to look at is a document called the VPAT. And the reason I want to look at the VPAT is because I want to understand if there are areas of nonconformance, what they are, so that I can make a plan for working around them. So if I open the URL for the VPAT and scroll through the document, there is a lot of content here. And these are the standards that I was talking about earlier, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And so I can look at all of the guidelines and see which are supported by Zoom and which are not supported. And so as a user of this venue, it's my responsibility to understand where there are areas of exceptions and where there are areas of where certain features are not supported. And so in preparing for this talk, I looked at the VPAT, and there were some areas of nonconformance, and Zoom explained them very clearly. And one of the potential problems seemed to be that the polling might be difficult. And so in this case, I thought, well, I really wanted to hear from you all about your roles and whether accessibility was in your position description. And I thought I would do that as a poll, but having seen that there were potential issues with that feature, I thought, well, it's mostly the data that's interesting. So I could collect that data in advance and then also share it with you all so that you could have that data as well. So instead, as many of you know, I set up a SurveyMonkey survey, and I asked the questions that I would have asked in a poll in a survey in advance. And that gave us time to answer the questions and compile the data. So sometimes the solution is a matter of thinking about your objective and identifying alternatives that would get you there without creating unnecessary barriers. And I want to pause to point out that and to acknowledge that that approach may not have been the best at the end of the day. Some of you may not have had a chance to respond to the survey, and you would have liked to be counted in the data of the presentation. And also, the more I experimented with SurveyMonkey, I discovered that it had changed from the tool that I had used previously, and it was not as accessible as it had been in the past. And so my mistake there was not looking at the VPAT for SurveyMonkey before choosing to use that tool. And I wanted to share that because sometimes our role in making a web for everyone is making mistakes and learning from them and doing better, and also sharing what you've learned so that others can learn as well. So in terms of looking at platforms, what you'll want to do is identify potential accessibility barriers and then define an approach to using the platform that avoids those barriers. And then coming back to that question of presenting content and what are key considerations you make sure you to think about when you're presenting. Another aspect of that is presenting content. And some of the things that I strive to do as a presenter is one is to manage the communication channel, to pause to allow people who are using screen reader software to participate in the chat without needing to manage multiple channels. And, in a sense, to make the chat a main channel rather than a back channel when the objective of the activity is group discussion and sharing perspectives. I'll want to share accessible presentation materials so that people can participate in the event without having anxiety about missing something, and people can engage with the content in a way that suits them best. And so the conference will be sharing, presentation slides, and also the follow-up email that has resource links in it are ways to kind of manage accessible content. And one aspect of that is giving content away. Holding content close doesn't help anybody at the end of the day. So sharing as much content as you have is an accessible practice. And then another aspect is weaving visual information into the verbal narrative. And that's something I try to do. And it's an art and science, I think. There are various protocols that are good models for this, like Think Aloud protocol, so that when I'm showing you a website, I try to think aloud as I'm walking through it to give you a sense of what is happening on the screen if you're not able to see the screen. And thinking about presenting, I don't know, a podcast or some kind of audio only, a phone call is a way to kind of be thoughtful and intentional about the information that you're conveying. And as I've said previously, my approach might not always be ideal for everyone. For example, this week, after I kind of worked on my script, there was a Twitter conversation about whether sharing your haircut is actually helpful to people who can't see it. And so listening to those different perspectives and constantly learning and questioning and learning and listening. And in some ways, that's the way I think about the difference between doing accessibility and being accessibility. And so a while back, I was researching Agile methodology to explore how accessibility is included in that methodology. And I stumbled into this concept that struck me as very pertinent to accessibility. And it's the difference between transitioning to Agile as a development methodology, we won't go into that, and transforming into an Agile organization. And it was summed up as the difference between doing Agile and being Agile. And I like that a lot. I'm going to pause a moment because I think the interpreters are trying to switch off. And I just don't stop long enough to give you a chance, which is another important accessibility presentation tool. In thinking about this talk, I kept coming back to that idea of transitioning and transforming and the difference between doing accessibility and being accessibility, and thinking about what that looks like. And many of us didn't learn accessibility as part of our education programs. And if you're like me, your path didn't include technology at all. I stumbled into technology having studied French horn and music theory in college. And I know many of you have a similar origin story, starting down a particular path in your early studies and your education programs, and then ending up somewhere else, sometimes somewhere completely unrelated. And if you are game, I'd like to pause just a few moments so you can share your starting point in the chat. So we have some people who started in web design and communications. For older people like me, there was no web, so I didn't start in that. We have design to social work to tech, athletic training, nonprofit communications, graphic design and accessible PDFs, disability accommodations and state programs, online program management. It's always so neat to hear about where people came from. Early childhood education, future UX role, yes. E-commerce, parent and future program director. Anthropology, wow, that's quite a journey. Anthropology to library studies to IT. That's great. Education, communications, insurance. This is wonderful. Administrative assistant, hotels. Gosh, I'd love to spend all day just sharing these stories. And so that's really what I wanted to emphasize is that's what we're doing this week. And in our work, we're teaching each other and we're learning from each other. And as we do that, we transform, like a tadpole to a frog or a caterpillar to a butterfly. We transform by doing, by learning. So doing plus being equals another one of my equations. Doing plus being equals accessibility transformation. And that's really what we need. We need an accessibility transformation. Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, said in a Guardian interview in 2017, "It has taken all of us to build the web we have, and now it's up to all of us to build the web we want for everyone." Today, we focused on position descriptions and how they define our work and ourselves. Thinking about your role and your position description, I invite you to take this discussion forward. And I have some homework for you, job description homework. Think about 3 tasks that you currently do that should be explicitly defined in your position description. And also think about 3 accessibility responsibilities and tasks you would add to transform your role to better support accessibility. And don't feel like you need to stop at 3, but shoot for 3 as a minimum. Write them down as a definition, as a contract with yourself and everyone, and keep coming back to it, revising, transforming like an accessibility butterfly. Help make the web we want for everyone. We can't get there without you. Thank you very much.
Awesome, Sarah, thank you so much. It looks like I'm just double checking to see whether we have any questions that have come in, which is why I'm a little bit washed out because I have a massive monitor with a bunch of bright color aiming at my face, but I don't see any questions. Thank you so much, really. I'm really glad that it worked out that you could join us. We really appreciate you leading us off, the lead-off hitter this year.